It's a theological world. After all, after all, after all, after all.
Matthew, it's good to have you on. Thanks for coming. And I've enjoyed getting to know you recently. Actually last year at some point we met and realized that we lived close by here in Birmingham, Alabama. So it's good to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Joshua. It's been a pleasure getting to know you, and we have a mutual friend and Dr. Eric Johnson, and he connected to us, and man, that's what Christianity is all about, right? It's being in fellowship with other believers, and that's been part of God's blessing in my life, is meeting people like you and people who are wanting to live the Christian life significantly and with thoughtfulness, and you just have such a warm presence about you. So it's been great to get to know you and have a new friendship.
Yeah, it's been good. It's been really good. So let me fill out your intro a little bit, your bio. You're the head of Tactical Faith, which is an apologetics organization locally here in Birmingham. You guys have been really successful. You've been around for a while. You've had a lot of great lectures, conferences, and you're also a professor at Stanford University, where you teach in the great books or great texts. What do you guys call it? Great texts?
We call it core text.
Core
yeah,
text.
It's like a great books program. It is.
Yeah. And so you do that. You're a father, husband, and you're working on a dissertation right now, right?
I am. It's my second doctorate. I have a doctorate of ministry and a master's of divinity from Beeson Divinity School, and now I'm working on my PhD.
Great. Yeah, very good. And that's at Beeson as well. Is that correct?
That's at Midwestern Theological Seminary.
Midwestern, right, right. Very good, very good. Well, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Did you want to say anything else about Tactical Faith, what you're doing, what's going on this year?
No, it's great. I think that was a great introduction. Meeting you has been great, and it's been providential. Me and you are thinking on the same lines of where we think people are and what questions people are asking, and we're working together to, this year, one of our themes, we have a theme every year. It's a workable theme for us as it kind of guides us with who we want to bring in and what are the questions we want answered, or at least to think about. And our guiding question this year, like you said, is what does it mean to be human? Which I think you would agree is on the minds of so many people today on where we live.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's an important question today, especially as we enter in this new tech age, as we enter the space of AI and how it's changing us already, which I'm sure we'll talk about to some degree in a moment. So you've been involved in this space, apologetic space, for quite some time now. You've had quite a hand. Tactical Faith has been, it's certainly made an impression. And so you've been an important figure in contemporary apologetics, I would say. How do you describe your own journey in this space, and what led you to found Tactical Faith? Why did you do it?
Yeah, another great question, Joshua. And I keep reflecting on that question personally as it guides me in doing what I do. And one of the things that I look back on and realize is that God has been incredibly faithful in my life and has had his hand in my life. I came preloaded to some degree in adulthood with a lot of assumptions, and came from a great Christian family, a great Christian environment. I would say a great Christian culture in the deep state of, the deep South of Alabama, deep in the heart of Texas, deep in the heart of Alabama. Sorry, it is morning when we're recording. Yes. I grew up with a huge Christian community that was deep and significant when it comes to value and character. Even to some degree, my intellectual life was fun, but it wasn't until I became a junior in high school that I pulled God on the Dock and Other Essays, which is a book my father was reading by C.S. Lewis. That and Problem of Pain were two books that fundamentally changed my direction. And that direction was a fascination into kind of what I would consider the deeper thought life of a Christian, and how there's 2,000 years of real significant thinking about our faith, about the frameworks of our faith, and how our faith not only applies to us ethically, but also how it applies to our life of the mind and how we see the world. And that started right after, I took that into college. And when I went into adulthood after graduation, I was really seeking like-minded people who were thinking the same way I was. And as well as I do, I'm 49 years old. So 25 years ago was what I would consider one of the first or second, well, probably the second real heyday of apologetic movement in the evangelical world. And I had so many resources to pull from. I had a lot of people that were 20, 30 years ahead of me. They were taking the banner of Sean McDowell's dad and others from the 60s and 70s. And now that we have a new baby boomer group that came 25 years ago, that were writing like Greg Kokel and William Lane Craig and others that were doing, and J.P. Moreland, that were doing significant work in the field of the life of the mind and the Christian walk, and Dallas Willard and others like that. And it was a huge, exciting world that I was introduced to in my high school years. And then I just kind of swam deep in my college and post-college young adult years. And I just noticed right away that the church was not doing a great job in helping people like me think about their faith. I've always been so supportive of the church and pastors and people in the church. So I'm not saying that to degrade them. I'm more just saying I saw myself in my place that God had put me in as to help the church and to facilitate, growth in the life of the mind, and especially for the people of my state, in the state of Alabama. So when I was at First Baptist Montgomery, and I was kind of on staff there, I shadowed the pastor for a couple of years when we had moved to Montgomery, and he allowed me an opportunity to kind of shape a ministry. And that ministry ended up becoming Tactical Faith, whose goal is to help facilitate the life of the mind in apologetics and theology and worldview in the state of Alabama. And we started in 2011. Were established in 2011 and 12, and we've been around ever since. We are a volunteer organization. I've never taken a penny from it, and we've given probably $700,000, $800,000 of money, donation money, to that goal of becoming that. We have talked about this before, but a bridge between the Ivory Tower and the local church setting. And I think and we're mirror. So, we worked with Catholic, Orthodox, and every shade of Protestant to basically try to spur on the intellectual life in my state. And, along with other programs like Apologetics Resource Center and a few others in Alabama, I think, compared to them, we've done some great work. And, we've been kind of under the radar to some degree. We're not big, we're not flashy. But I think we've moved the needle some.
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of changes when it comes to how apologetics has looked over the last 12, 13 years.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. I think we had similar, some overlap in terms of how we were formed early on. I'm a little younger than you, but it was about 20 something years ago. 25, I don't know, teenager. When I was a teenager, I started developing and practicing the spiritual disciplines more, and my faith was becoming a bit more serious and disciplined, matured, hopefully. And it was right around that time that apologetics was really kind of important for me in terms of, for formation purposes. The life of the mind became important. And so all the figures, I think, that, we could name off that shaped or had an influence on you, probably had an influence on me. Uh, early on, of course, some of the fathers of more contemporary apologetics, evangelical apologetics, of course, the Norman Geislers, the Sean McDowells, and those guys, few others that we could name. Of course, J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig. J.P. Moreland's book, I still point back to and as like one of the most formative books in my life, and that is How to Love the Lord Your God with all your mind, right, or with all your soul.
I think it's all your mind. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, that one was hugely influential in my life as a young man in my 20s. And so, yeah, looking at apologetics today, what do you think is doing well or has been going well? And where do you think it's struggling?
Yeah, I think that's a great question too. Well, I think I'd have to go back a little bit. I think me and you were heavily influenced by classical apologists and to some degree some presuppositionals, but most evidentialist and classical arguments, or those who hold to those methodologies, I would say had the most impact on me, which you're talking about from 1995 to maybe 2010. Mm-hmm. Around 2008, 2009, you started to see kind of a little bit of a change of emphasis, and I would probably say that's because of the growth in the growth of the millennial generation, who were starting to see evangelism and apologetics more story-driven, less about the actual winning the argument part from a classical or an evidentialist point of view. And for me, not necessarily embracing, I wouldn't say a presuppositional, but a cumulative kind of approach that included things like story and the imagination. So I would say by 2010 and 11, while a lot of apologetics from the evidentialist or the classical form was still there, still doing really good work, really things started shifting pretty quick. More towards, like I said, a kind of a narrative approach. And I saw that especially in evangelism as well. So, but that's not to say that things, from our point of view, from an evidentialist or classical point of view, was now null and void. It was just the emphasis had changed. The world had been changing. I would say from President Obama's election on, the world has significantly changed in a lot of different ways. So, but I would say lately, though, post-COVID in 2020, though, you see the rise of a younger generation, a Gen Z and a Gen Alpha, that you're starting to see more of a stronger classical approach, like Wesley Huff and others that are starting to really present themselves as knowledgeable in a lot of different areas. Their general apologetics is super strong, and they're starting to look like the apologists of old. So maybe there's a pendulum that swings based on many factors. It's a generational issue, it's a cultural issue. But I would say two noticeable ways by which apologetics has changed in our life, Joshua, is first, it broadened from, like I said, winning arguments to making sense of the world. People aren't asking questions specifically, is Christianity true? As much as they're asking, can Christianity be a worldview that kind of makes sense of the world and hold me together? Mm-hmm. Can it sustain me in terms of community and hope? So that pushed us as apologists to talk more about like plausibility structures or worldview. The social and imaginative conditions that make belief, feel alive or dead. Second, I would say apologetics has now become more part of the attention economy. The challenge here is not just disbelief. Our challenge now is things like, and I see this as a teacher, things like cynicism and distraction. The issue of, now that I'm a parent and watching my older teens now, is just how do you deal with a fragmented self? So the apologetic endeavor, task, is now increasingly includes helping people recover. With the capacity to perceive like all of reality truthfully. And this is one of the reasons why that I teach. And when I was with the Alabama Baptists in a consulting forum, I would go to churches and I would basically, I'm taking an old Ronald Nash presuppositional kind of method of just going back to basic grounding worldview questions, and then taking some from other places, like basic questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, and questions like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be in relationship to nature? How are we related to God or gods? And ultimately, how are we related to each other? Those are now the basis of my apologetic strategy, because I think it does help those two noticeable changes that I just mentioned. It is to some degree still about applying arguments and answers to arguments, but it's also about helping people foresee the world and see the world because they're siloed and fragmented, and help them sustain some sort of meaningful structure that can make sense of the world.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Yeah, well, let's unpack that a little bit. Let's think about that. You've jumped into my next question already. So what kinds of questions do you think have changed? And what do we need to change in terms of our apologetic approach? So you've already started answering that. I remember in 2011 coming back to the United States, you mentioned President Barack Obama, and I had been living in the University of Bristol in England for a time there, where I was pursuing my doctoral studies, and that was a great time. Loved England. Came back to the States, moved to Texas, the great state, the big state of Texas. And everything felt big. So going from England, not just coming back to the United States, which is a counterculture shock, but going to the big state of Texas, massive. It was massive. So, I mean, Texas is probably bigger than England, isn't it? I think it is, right?
A little bit.
Quite a lot. So when I came back in 2011, I was wrapping up my doctorate while in the States, and I don't know, it could have been me, could have been counterculture. But when I got here, 2011, things really, this very mystical, but intuitive. Maybe sometimes our intuitions are onto something. Many times they are. The United States felt very different. It felt very different to me. Like, this is a new world we're entering, and I'm still in an old world, and I feel uncomfortable here. I really felt uncomfortable. The dynamics seemed to be changing. It seemed to me the social values, the social structures that were normative seemed to be in flux, changing, and that was uncomfortable. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe it was just my perception. I think it was changing already. You mentioned a lot about I guess I'll put a word to it, disillusionment in the church, maybe disillusionment. There's maybe some of that going on in the generations that are coming behind us. Certainly there have been, there's been this whole movement of ex-evangelicals, and we can point to pretty big name, well-known evangelicals whose children have left the faith and made it very public, and made a kind of a big deal about it. But I think there's something about the undercurrent there in the shift that may be reflective of some other cultural patterns that need to be assessed or addressed. I think that's what you're also picking up on as well, if I'm hearing you correctly. So, in some ways, in apologetics, it feels like the apologetics movement were, to some extent, still answering yesterday's questions. But we're living in an age where the mental and spiritual landscape is actually changing and has changed. And so, I guess it's always good to have the older apologists of the age who are trained by the Geislers and the Craigs, who are doing like more rigorous, certainly work of like confirming the existence of God, the coherence of God or coherence of theism. And I mean, I'm a believer in we need that kind of work, of course, and at varying stages of our life, we may need it. But I'm not sure that most of the generations that are the millennial generation and the younger generations that are coming up, that they're really like, that's certainly at the forefront of their mind. And that's really what's causing them disillusionment, maybe causing them to lose faith, maybe part of a larger kind of apostasy. Maybe if there is that, maybe there is an apostasy. I don't it seems like there's more going on. So where do you think the next phase of apologetics is? Where do we need to go?
Yeah, that's a great question. All great questions, Joshua. I don't know. It's not an easy one to answer because it's super complicated and it's very layered. I'm like you. I'm so indebted to the apologetics in kind of world that I came out of, more so now than maybe ever before. I never turned my back from it, and I wouldn't say I became disillusioned with it, but I would say that, you know, as a practitioner in this world, in the way that I am, which is a very unique way that I'm a practitioner in apologetics. I dare say I'm not one that sits and thinks that I'm the one that can give you a pure definition of where apologetics is, what it is, and where it's going. But I would say intuitively, my journey 10 years ago when I started my doctorate of ministry at Beeson Divinity School really came out of 4 or 5 years of tactical faith and seeing a lot of people come to my door, have questions, well-meaning Christians who would eventually just leave. And they were usually our age or younger. They were looking for something. They were very significant thinkers. These aren't people that were academics necessarily, but they were in their church and they were desperately looking for something or some path or some way to give attention to their faith that was not fully realized. And then they would leave, using your words, disillusioned. That put me on a certain path of accepting a doctorate kind of in ministry, Beeson, with the knowledge that Beeson was going to let me kind of pursue this question. You know, why are people in the life of the mind leaving? And one of the things that I came out with after looking at you know, what some would call wisdom literature, others would probably have an issue with that of that genre label. But I started looking at things like fear of the Lord. I started looking at Psalms and Proverbs, and I started looking at Christ and seeing, well, what's the mode of attention that these great thinkers and works, when it comes to knowledge and understanding, what am I missing? What are these people disillusioned about? And when I came to discover is there's such a relationship between who you are and how you think. Okay. And I'm going a roundabout way of answering your question, and I'll get there. But I think what had happened was entering into this new world that you're talking about. It really shined the light shone the light on a weakness in the apologetic world and the evangelical world that we weren't ready for, which was this idea that if you have the right inputs, evidences, syllogism, historical cases, and you just know those things, then we'll eventually get the right outputs, convictions, courage, faith. So it's like you learn this and then you're going to become this person. It's not like that at all. And in fact, it's multimodal for sure. And I'm not saying one starts before the other, But what I would say is there's such a relationship between morally who you are and how you process information.
Mhm.
So much so that all of a sudden I realized, oh, so the beginning of understanding is really kind of is an act of humbleness. And that's with anything in education at all. In order for you to learn as a child, you have to be humbled. But there's no different when you're an adult. There's like a character element to knowing things. We don't work by just getting the right knowledge input and expecting conviction to come out of it. Now, it's part of it, right? Because learning things give you courage and can lead to conviction.
Mhm.
But we are more often than not, we don't work like that as human beings. We're formed by things like what we love, or what we repeatedly do, or what we fear, what we consume, what we call quote unquote normal. So I began to realize that it's not abandoning the arguments, but maybe resituating them
Mhm.
to a degree where apologetics now needs to needs to sit in a different kind of attentional framework. So what I ended up figuring out was, at least through my DMin and over the last 10 years was how closely aligned morals and virtue and ethics was to processing information. So in that way, you're realigning your ecclesiological kind of purpose and understanding things like the Lord's Supper and working out in the world the way Jesus did to the poor and the needy. Those are ways of training your attention and training how you see the world, just as much as reading a book or following a thought leader in the Christian world or following a pastor and taking in what they have to say. All those things are super important.
Yeah.
But what is also important is understanding how who you are as a Christ follower affects how you see the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Who you are affects how you see the world.
And that matters with things like imagination. You pointed to imagination because people just don't reject propositions. They reject a picture of reality, right?
Mhm.
And they're going to reject things that feel thin, implausible, ugly. So we don't offer just claims. The Christian worldview offers a worldview picture.
Mhm.
And our goal as apologists are trying to help people see that particular world again, right?
Yeah.
As a pilgrim, you have to train yourself to see the picture of the world the way Christ wants you to see it. And that is giving up of the old world and taking on a new set of perception or attention. And that is character driven, and that's knowledge, and that's an epistemological issue and a virtue issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alistair McIntyre and other thinkers often talk about beliefs that we have or beliefs that we hold as rooted in some way in practices and maybe in traditions. And those practices are rooted in some way in traditions, in concrete community expressions. So one of the critiques of kind of much of evangelical kind of apologetics has been that the practices have been decoupled, or the beliefs that we have about ultimate meaning and reality in the world have been decoupled from practices themselves, and they've become abstractions that are not connecting with the people, not connecting with their concrete experience. And so that's been kind of a critique of that kind of movement. Right. So so maybe we need to reclaim some of that. I mean, I'm not opposed to abstractions, but it does seem to me that, there was something really good and corrective about, James K. Smith coming on the scene of theology or apologetics broadly construed. He probably wouldn't want to call himself an apologist. James K. Smith coming on the scene with his books, recent books in years, talking about liturgy. We need to reclaim a liturgy, right? Everybody has a liturgy. Years ago, I didn't even think in these terms. I didn't even ask this basic question, what are my practices? What are my liturgy? I mean, he would talk about how in the 90s, this is kind of foreign today maybe, but people had liturgies, mall liturgies. Remember the malls?
Mm-hmm.
I love the malls. They were cool.
Yeah, I miss the malls.
I do too. It was, in the 90s, it was really something like, we would just, as friends or family, we'd just go to the mall and walk around. It was fun. But we don't have that anymore. But anyway, he would talk about liturgy and how liturgy is deeply embedded in, it's a kind of set of practices, cultural values, norms, and these sorts of things that shape who we are, what we are, how we become. And so I think that's what I'm hearing you saying in the apologetics world. Maybe we need to think about that quite a bit more in terms of how you use this word attention, how we're attending to the arguments.
Yeah, I think so, because we're not inviting people just to know something. We're inviting people to know someone and to be related to a certain kind of people. So while you have to get the knowledge part correct, that's not the thing that we're worshiping. We're not worshiping an idea. We're worshiping persons, a person, we're worshiping God, and we're worshiping the incarnate Lord who sits on the throne. So absolutely. I think that's where the disconnect was. And I'm not so sure that maybe the generation before us, whether they're the boomer generation or that before, they were living off cultural credit to some degree, because the American culture was still so had a deep-seated kind of commitment to a Christian kind of assumptions, even though they were disappearing or at least being reduced. So in other words, they could probably function from that apologetic level differently than what me and your transitional generation, we're Zennials, we're somewhere between Generation X and Millennials. We saw both worlds. And when you talk about changing of both worlds, we sat right in the middle of it. And that changes what became the base assumptions of our shared story in America has now changed. Or, but still a shadow of Christianity going around, especially where we live in Birmingham. It's very strong still. But ultimately, from a United States kind of bigger kind of framework, the Christian story is no longer that effective. So as it was 20, 30 years ago. So of course, apologetics, which is, the pursuit and discipline of trying to, give a reason for why we hope, has to change along with it. And people like James Smith and these others, they picked up on it, but picked on it from a different perspective, but in ways that we could include in our apologetic strategy that would be helpful. I don't think there's one way of doing apologetics, by the way. I know that was a big deal when we were coming through, which methodology, which one do you, are you classical or are you a fideist, God forbid you're a fideist, that kind of idea. That's no longer like even bubbling up in the arguments anymore, even amongst us. So, now it's more like how in the world are we going to reach a new group of people that don't even know who Christ is? That's the reason why people like Rod Dreher and others are talking about a reawakening, or what do they call the strategy? A reawakening of wonder, and wonder is just a re-enchantment of the world that we live in, so that they can be fertile ground for the gospel message, is what we really should be praying for.
Yeah, good. Good. Yeah, let's think about that a little bit more. So, you've talked a lot about imagination practice. We've talked about liturgy. We're entering into this new theme this year, and Technical Faith is talking about what it means to be human. So, do we, as in the apologetics world, need to recover kind of thicker anthropology that takes seriously habit, practice, liturgy, imagination, attention? And I think this would be an important theme that we've talked about before, that you're picking up on and you're talking about, you're researching and writing about right now, and that's embodiment.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I mean, it's probably overused now, but things like ChatGPT and Claude and Grok. I mean, these are large language models are now forcing us to ask, well, what's unique about us? If a machine can imitate language and art, and even to some degree, kind of a shallow companionship, then who are we? I mean, what distinguishes us? What makes us different? Why are we any different than, something that can almost seem like it's human? And that creates more fragmentation and more anxiety and more stress. It continues to divide us in our community. It keeps us shallowed, keeps us siloed to get, separated from each other. I mean, I read something yesterday about how AI is going to put a stop to return to work initiatives. Because I mean, why spend all your money on office space when people can just work from home? Like we're doing right now. I mean, me and you are not together. We're not incarnationally together.
Mhm.
We're using this thing as a tool, and it can do good stuff, but it is changing and rearranging our relationships to each other. So what does that mean for us? Because power, when we come together as a group of image bearers, incredible things happen. When we come together with the same will and targeted towards the same goal, it's incredible what we can do together. So much so that God had to step in and babble, right? I mean, we can either do incredibly great things or very fearful things together. Well, when you split us apart and fragment us to where we're no longer, we're disembodied to some degree in our relationships, then who are we? So the question of what is human is unavoidable right now. It's because we're living through this crisis of attention, crisis of identity, and where are we going to go in the future? And I would say right now there's a low hum of anxiety amongst all of us post-COVID. Like most of us know that we're in a crisis point, and most of us just can't see the future, and we can't live like that. So the church is a unique space and place right now to speak into that vacuum.
Yes. Yeah. 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 I think that's right. Yeah. There's lots of questions surrounding technology, AI right now. I mean, there's a lot of, I think that's right. There's anxiety, a large undercurrent of anxiety for most people. And there are the techno-optimists out there. You might call them techno-optimists. But I'm reminded, I just watched an episode the other night, the newer version of The Outer Limits, season 1, episode 2, I think it was, season 1, episode 2. More extreme version of, there's this scientist who's handicapped and they're building a woman AI who's embodied. And, his friend who's a scientist says, presents it to him. And you may have seen this show. The 90s version was actually, this is unusual, but the 90s version was actually better than the first Outer Limits. In the case of the Twilight Zone, the first series was obviously, or the first one was obviously the best with Rod Serling. It's the best, right? The later versions or incarnations of Twilight Zone were not as good. But the later version of the Outer Limits, I think, was better than the first one. Anyway, so in the story, there's this woman that's being made, if that's even possible. I mean, they were she was being made, and the scientist who was handicapped, this girl was going to be made for him as a kind of partner or mate and things. And his initial reaction was just negative, so put off, like disgusted that his friend scientist would build a woman and this artificial woman to provide him with a partner. And I think there's something in that response that maybe we need to focus. We need to attend on a bit more. Maybe there's something right. There's something right about that response. His initial response. Now, eventually, as with many things with technology, in much, subtler and of less extreme examples, we become more these things become more normalized in our lives, and we become very accepting of them. And maybe we shouldn't have, and there may be some things that we shouldn't accept and allow to be normalized. There's lots in terms of the internet we could talk about and how it's changed us. The internet itself, even prior to all this AI, artificial intelligence, that maybe we should have attended to more carefully. It's already changed us. It's here. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not a Luddite. We're both friend. I'm a friend of Paul Kingsnorth. He's a good friend of mine. At least I like to call him a good friend of mine. We talk a lot. Even and I understand his point of view, and I think it's super helpful. I use these tools. I've played around with them. I have a phone. In fact, I'm deaf in my left ear, so I walk around with new Phonak hearing aids that are quote unquote AI integrated, whatever that even means anymore. It's like a marketing buzzword. I love tech. I grew up. Again, we're the transition generation. We know the analog world, but we also know how to use the digital world. So I was always first in tech. I mean, I was in the computer field for about 10 years while my wife was in the medical world, or at least training in medicines. And so I was a network administrator, loved computers, and I have a computer science background and a history major as well. So that world I understand. But I think that's one thing about the Christian worldview that's so fun, is it's so universal. It's broad in a lot of ways, but it's also very concrete in its mere principles. Because if you look back over the last 1,500, 1,600 years, especially post Reformation and in the Enlightenment, we get into the mud and mire of culture and try to figure these things out, right? And we have branches in Christianity that basically, say technology and the advancement of it is not for us. So we're going to live in our own communities, and and they hold technology off. And then there's communities in Christianity that don't, and they embrace it and use it and try it in order to reach people, and they integrate it into worship. So we're incredibly broad that way, where Christianity can kind of hold those two together and still be in community as brothers and sisters in Christ. So we don't have to necessarily be fearful of the new tools, but I like and not use them. But I think we need to be cautious on what they do to us in terms of our value and as humans. And I think that's where people like Paul Kingsnorth are very helpful. Anything that's going to further devalue who we are, then we need to make sure that that we're committed to valuing human beings. And if the tools that we've been given don't, then we need to do away with them. And I think AI is just one of those things that right now we're testing and looking at and see what it does. I'm very fearful of it, but I can also see how it can be used in terms of its advantage. But I don't know. I'm not as anti-tech, but I'm not so willing to fully embrace it either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of your areas of study has been is in the Lord's Supper right now, I think. Is that right?
It is.
Yeah, I think so let's talk about that in this context. We've been talking about embodiment and AI, the importance of embodiment, how we should use artificial intelligence in this kind of context of thinking about the apologetics in the new age and what we need to do, how we need to pivot as human beings. Why do you think the Eucharist matters so much for how we understand reality and truth?
Again, that goes back to what we're talking about. I think at the end of the day, even when we're talking about issues like AI and what's that going to do to us, you have to go back to how am I processing that question? Ultimately, how do I answer the ethical issues and the practical implications of something like AI? Well, it goes back to fundamental questions that we have and answers those fundamental questions for our worldview, right? So what does Christianity say about who we are, right? And what does it mean to be human? And how you answer that question, and along with other questions like, what is our origins? Where do we come from? Where do we go after we die? What is our meaning? What does it mean to have good and evil? Those are what I tell my students when I teach in the core text program is there's a basic story you tell yourself about yourself. And that is how you're going to see the world, right? How you interpret the world all comes out through the glasses that you wear. There's a worldview glasses by which you filter the world through, right? That's the old kind of image that we were given about and when it comes to worldview and apologetics. I think for me, it's not, we're not in a brain trivia world, right? Where we just attend to the world in terms of just responding in terms of better ideas or knowledge, right? Christianity offers something different. It offers a kind of knowing, right? A kind of attention that's rooted in knowledge, worship, communion. The heart of Christianity is not controlled by information or explanation, but a reconciliation, right? Of coming back into the presence of God. God didn't save us by sending a textbook. He did give the law, but the law was not what God necessarily wanted. The law was there to push us towards back into his presence, right? And ultimately that came in the incarnated, flesh of Jesus Christ, right? He came among us, right? So the church, the Christian church, when the Holy Spirit came down and instituted his church, becomes in my mind, this is what I'm working on, and nobody go out there and steal it, but I think this is kind of where I'm at, is that the church itself is a school of attention, right? So our job in our church is to train people to see reality truthfully, right? And that's just not knowledge. That's inviting ourselves into the presence of God amongst other believers, and we're focused on not just data, but a person, right? And then when you do that, then things become like creation becomes a gift. People become not instruments, but they become image bearers, right? Suffering now is made sense because it's now bearable in hope. And that our truth is ultimately in a personal relationship with each other in Christ and individually with Christ. So this is where I go. This is where I think somebody like Dr. Ian McGilchrist has become some helpful for me. Now, there's things about his way of seeing that I probably wouldn't fully embrace. But ultimately, he's given me a framework by which to understand the world. And we can go into that if you want to. But the reason I went into the Eucharist, because my dissertation right now is looking at how the Eucharist is shaping our attention. How something like the act of the ordinance of the Lord's Supper or the sacrament, depending on your tradition, how does that shape our attention to the world? Most of us, and I don't care what tradition you're in, whether it's low church or incredibly high church, how you give attention to the world matters. How you give attention to your worship and tradition matters. And most of us can hollow that out by just seeing either worship or communion as just a practice to be done. right? It's just a thing that we do. As us, the Baptist world that I'm in, we might do it every once in a while. You have some traditions that do it every time they meet together. But what's unavoidable is that if we give just a plain Jane act, as if that's just a plain act, and give attention that's shallow like that, then we're doing it a disservice. I grew up in a tradition that said you basically you're morally bound to forgive, ask God for forgiveness before you take the supper, right? In other words, check your heart before you do this. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but at least I think what was bound up in that is to understand this is important, and the Lord's Supper is important, and not just important because you just have to do it and God commanded it, Jesus commanded it. It's more important than that. It is a shared attention habit that really forms you into the outside world. All right. And it is in a lot of ways. I mean, we're nerds. You just mentioned you're a sci-fi nerd, apparently.
Yeah.
I'm a big nerd in all things sci-fi. It's kind of like cosplaying the Upper Room every time we get together.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we're doing. We're enacting a play, right? To some degree. I'm not trying to make light of it, but we're reenacting something that's supposed to give us a similar shared attention as the disciples gave Christ. And in that way, the more we know about the Eucharist and behind it in terms of, what it gave attention to, I mean, that's the reason why if you have a Messianic Jew that comes in and gives you the background of the Lord's Supper, it makes it more meaningful, because then you can enter into the room, into the minds of the disciples in a way where we can frame the Lord's Supper. So to go back to Lord, and this is a very complicated answer, but going back to Ian McGilchrist, who is a neuroscientist and also a psychologist, says that the brain functions in two different ways. It has a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and not the pop psychology where left means you're good at math and the right means you're good at art. That's not what he's talking about. What he says is that I would say designed, but we're created in a certain way, and that's my language, not his. But we're made to be in a certain way by which the right and the left hemisphere function to give attention to the world. And they do that in order to, one, keeps us safe. Like the left hemisphere needs knowledge. It needs to make things concrete. It needs to look at the world in a very specific way. So it's after data, right? It's collecting data all the time. But the right hemisphere is more abstract. It's more interested in presence. It doesn't mind ambiguity. It's kind of a river that kind of flows, right? And that's his language. In that sense, it's okay with, it wants presence. It wants wonder, and it uses the left hemisphere in order to gather information. But the left hemisphere in his language is not the master. The master really is your right hemisphere, which is your ability to see the world in a way by which you don't have to control it. That's ultimately what he's saying, that that you individually cannot mine a certain thing to the point where you know it all, right? And the goal of the left hemisphere is control. It doesn't want fear. It wants security. The goal of the right hemisphere really is presence. It's incarnational presence. It's community. That's why things like poetry and art get assumed to be a part of the right hemisphere. Now, what's that have to do with your question with the Lord's Supper? Well, this is all my research. The Lord's Supper, what you're after as a Christian is to take on the mind of Christ. What Ian McGilchrist brings to the table is kind of a framework to get you there, in my mind, which is we need to make sure that the right hemisphere way of attending to the world continues to stay kind of the master. And that's the world of humility, virtue, and understanding the world in a way where you're okay with not having full control over it, right? He argues that we live in a world now we live in the post-enlightenment world where the left hemisphere has become the master. That all we're after and aiming for is more knowledge, more knowledge, more knowledge, more data, more data, more data. And that has, if you're a student of this as much as I am, and one of the reasons why I teach in the Cortex curriculum, because you see this discussion post-Enlightenment of seeing the world more as a mechanical kind of thing to be manipulated. To be manipulated, to be controlled. And if we can be controlled, then we know what's going to happen in the future. If we can control the future, then we don't have fear anymore, right? That's ultimately the aim of the Enlightenment world. What the re-enchantment world really is trying to get us to get back to is making an understanding, no, that's important to have knowledge, but that's not ultimately who we are. And bound in all that is the mystery of the Eucharist, right? Or the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
Which is, it is a thing. And think about our arguments in the Lord's Supper too. We have these traditions of arguments in the Baptist world on whether or not this piece of bread is God's flesh. And you have all these people that are arguing about that, right? Well, I think that's fine, and we can have that argument. But at the end of the day, I don't care. You know, at the end of the day, they're fine to have those arguments. But it doesn't, that's a left hemisphere thing. I need to know what this is. Instead of saying we are sharing in the presence, we're sharing with each other and cosplaying to some degree, or reenacting in some degree, an important thing that went on in the upper room. Because not only are we invited to do that when God comes back and to be in fellowship with him, but it retrains the way by which we can see the world. That it has real effects on us as image bearers on how we process information. And for me, that's super important and also super interesting to kind of research. That's the reason why Ian McGilchrist, when I asked him, Dr. McGilchrist, about this, he said, well, Matt, the problem is you're left hemisphering why you should write hemisphere or something, you know, which is kind of what he's doing. But for me, I'm trying to apply it as a heuristic to ultimately all that we do with the church in order to remind people that the church still matters. That gathering together still matters, that worship still matters, that mission still matters, that all these things matter because not only are they good and true and beautiful, but they retrain our attention in order to serve the world the way that Jesus served it when he walked here.